Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Myers. I teach in the Department of History, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture on behalf of the UCLA Alan Levy Center. This actually is the occasion of the Naphthalin Family Program on Studies in Jewish Identity, and we're really privileged to have with us Professor Magda Teter from Fordham University, who is a professor of history and serves as the Shvidler Chair in Jewish Studies at Fordham. Magda Teter is really one of the most wide-ranging and creative historians of her generation. And in recognition of her excellence in scholarship and also as just a fantastic academic organizer, she serves as director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham. She is the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research, which is the most prestigious learned society in the field of Jewish studies in the United States, in North America. And it's really owing to her excellence and to her reputation as someone who has very wide intellectual horizons and also can get things done, that she serves as president of the American Academy for Jewish Research. She's the author of 4 books, beginning with Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, Sinners on Trial, Blood Libel, which was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award and the George Mosse Prize from the American Historical Association, and most recently, Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Antisemitism and Racism. This is a book that required Magda to, in a certain sense, retool herself. She commands the extremely wide and complicated literature on the Jew as the figure of suspicion and animosity in Christendom, extending back to the antiquity. It's a very thick and complicated subject, and with a vast literature which Magda has come to command. And I encourage you all to take a look at her books, particularly the penultimate one, Blood Libel, which traces that most odious claim about Jews in deep historical roots. But what this book, Christian Supremacy, required was coming to command a whole new body of literature, the body of literature dealing with anti-Black racism. And what she does in this book is to bring together those two discourses, those two phenomena, such that the figure of the Jew and the figure of the Black, which occupy, she argues persuasively, such a central place in the imaginary of Christians, come together, meet, in ways that are illuminating, not only, and perhaps not even in the first instance, in telling us about Jews and Blacks, but in telling us more about Christianity, about Christian culture, and the place of these figural representations of Jews and Blacks within it. So we're really privileged to have Professor Teter here with us to lay out the contours of the book, after which she and I will have an opportunity to be in conversation, and then we can open up for question and answer to conclude the program. Please join me in welcoming Professor Magda Teter.
Thank you, David, for the generous introduction, and thank you so much to you for coming here. I know it's been a very trying time for all of you here in the LA area, and I'm really grateful that you were able to come and make it here to hear me. So I want to tell you through the material that I engage with, but the story of how I got into the subject. As David mentioned, I had to step out of my comfort zone, my own field in Jewish history and Jewish studies, to a new field, entirely new field of Black history and American history. You can tell from my accent, I'm not American, I'm not trained in American history, so I had to really step outside, but it was really rewarding, even if extremely humbling, and revealing how much we as scholars engage in our own kind of take for granted in understanding our subjects when you move to an entirely new field. So I certainly have gained so much more respect for all scholars who are trying to combine and look and speak to fields in conversation. So the book kind of emerges from my frustration of teaching and writing about anti-Jewish hostility and anti-Semitism for many, many years. I felt that the literature on anti-Semitism is sort of engages with questions that don't lead far anywhere. It engages with countless debates over definitions. What is anti-Semitism in literature, and now, of course, recently also in legislature. It engages with questions of chronologies. When does it begin? Is it modern? Is it eternal? And it sort of tries to understand it from psychological point of view. Is it rational, political, irrational? And even scholars debate how we should spell it, right? And I, teaching it and reading it and engaging with my students, I kept asking myself, does it matter? Do these matter? So, but nonetheless, the field of the history of anti-Semitism is like that. And it was really in 2016 when I watched a film by Raoul Peck about James Baldwin, I'm Not Your Negro, in which there is a clip of James Baldwin from the PBS program, The Negro and the American Promise, from something. There's like an extra click for some reason. Maybe it's the Mac to PC chain. So Negro in the American Promise in 1962, in which Baldwin challenged Americans to think about why they created that caricature of a black person, which he explicitly uses the N-word, right? And he says, why was it necessary for you to create that? I am not that, I am a man, I'm not that caricature, but if you have it, if you created things, that means that you need it, and you need to answer yourself why you invented him. And when I saw that clip, it was this like big aha moment where it's like, this is like the Jew that is created in the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic literature and imagery that has nothing to do with the living and breathing Jews and their historical experiences, but it's the imaginary of the Jew as it is invented by Christians. It reminded me of this quote from a historian, a writer from the pre-war period, about that it's not Jews who are hated, but an imaginary of them, which is confounded with reality, and the Jews' actual faults play very unimportant part in this matter. So then I began this intrigued me, and I started reading more about American history, about Black history. And as I was reading, I kept writing on the margin of the books that I was reading. This reminds me of Jews, the debates over Jews, and I have all these notes. So just to give you a couple of examples. So in the Missouri debate in 1820, which is really the first debate in American history over the meaning of citizenship, the word obviously exists in the Constitution but is not defined. There were voices that were like this representative from Virginia, Representative Berber, saying that the Constitution could not have possibly included Indians, he says, free Negroes, mulattoes, and slaves in the phrase "we the people." He says because Constitution was framed by the European white men, it had to mean "we the white people." And he argued that they can stay, but that doesn't mean that they have full political rights, right? He says the poor slave and the free man of color are sufficiently protected by the state in everything absolutely necessary to personal comfort and preservation of life and property. But they don't necessarily deserve the same rights, the same political rights as white people. So that reminded me of all these debates over eligibility for citizenship about Jews in Europe in the aftermath of the French Revolution, where there were these voices who were asking whether, here is from the debates in the Netherlands, whether we in the Netherlands honor the rights of men or only a Christian men, the rights of citizens or only the rights of Christian citizens, right? Should we, and answering the question whether Jews should belong, whether they should regard Jews as alien residents with civil protections, or will we go further and regard them as Dutchmen? In other words, not only as our fellow humans, but also as fellow citizens on equal footing, right? So very similar framing, one obviously around religion, Jews as a religious group, although there will be racialized, as I'll show you in a moment. And in the United States, because of the way law has, at least since 1790, and the definition of naturalization around race is structured around race. And then we have the question, when I was, again, the question asked whether a black person can be a citizen, asked in the Dred Scott case, can a Negro whose ancestors were important to this country become a member of the political community, right? So again, citizenship is not just about living in a place with civil protections, but also about the political rights. And as we know, the answer to that question in the Dred Scott case was no. They cannot become entitled to all these rights, privileges, and immunities guaranteed to the. And then again, that reminded me of these debates in the revolutionary era, whether Jews can be integrated as citizens, or whether religion, the law of Moses, as they claimed, made the citizenship and full integration of the Jews impossible. And many of the thinkers at the time argued that yes, it makes it impossible, Jews would never be fully integrated, and urged the legislative bodies not to grant the Jews, whom we must always consider as foreigners among us, equality and the rights, and here in this case of French citizens and active citizens. And from the Dutch debates, collectively speaking, Jews cannot share in our budget. So these texts echo. They obviously are different and stress different things, but they nonetheless echo. In his book, Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram X. Kendi talks about assimilationism and improvement, and what he calls uplift suasion, that is the need to improve, that black people need to improve both themselves and be improved before they deserve to be granted whether equality or at least recognition and acceptance by white society. And that again reminded me of this whole genre and debates in the 18th century around how Jews needed to improve themselves and be improved before they could be considered as citizens, because Jews, their persecution created, as this one author writes, altered physical and moral character, and the need to reform them, and the possibility, we established the danger of tolerating them as they are, and the need of reform them, and the possibility of achieving this, right? And this big quote on the top is really from an advocate for Jewish citizenship and Jewish rights, and yet it is with an asterisk, right? And then below is just a title of a very well-known to scholars work on the civil improvement of Jews, again arguing that Jews needed to be improved before they could really deserve to be equal. And then there are Jewish writers who are writing the same thing in that kind of uplift suasion aspect, that Jews need to work on improving themselves, lose their accent, become more like people of the nations in which they wanted to be citizens of. And yet, even in that period of time, the two debates connected. But in the scholarship about the modern citizenship and Jewish belonging, the so-called Jewish emancipation, the topic of the debate over black people and their status, which obviously existed because France, for instance, had colonies in the New World that had slavery and had also black free people, was also brought up. And here's again from those debates in the Netherlands, where in the warning that Jews should not be immediately admitted, is a warning that the prudent care for the general well-being would be in this regard to demand their transition from the state of alienation and deep humiliation to citizenship and equality. The sacred rights of men untimely granted to the slaves of San Domingo served to the destruction of the French population, right? So in that making these connections. So as I'm reading and writing, I'm beginning to jot down these striking panels, and I came up with this list. And I won't go in detail with each one of them, but I want to highlight a couple of things. Most important one, that it became very clear to me that both Jews and black people serve as contrast figures to the sort of dominant identities. For in the case of religion, and it's to Christians, and in terms of the black people in the colonies, and especially in the United States, is to white identity as well. And we'll see it later on in how it enters the law as well. Here are examples of that contrasting, how they were used in contrast. So here is the, on the, I guess, your left, the figure of ecclesia, of the church of Christianity as this reigning queen, and over their synagogue, the representation of Judaism and of synagogue in that way, is the sort of it's a down, humiliated, blinded woman. And in more modern times, in anti-Semitic example of imagery, this is from a Nazi children's book, the contrast between the German and the Jew in that kind of very clear difference, the Jew as the caricature, right, of the thing. And here, less inflammatory, this is from Oliver Twist, Dickens's Oliver Twist, the Jew Fagin. Also, you can see in the imagery that contrasting the Christian girl and the Jew as this sort of menacing figure. And look at the girl, and now look at the imagery of the contrast in the racist American imagery. Here is from a 1900 book published in 1900 that actually argued against the very humanity of black people, but you can see that that imagery of caricature, of creating that image, what Baldwin was objecting to, and a very similar visual language that was applied, we've seen in Europe, to contrasting the Christians and Jews. And here is another one, again, also using religion, but religion and race here, Christianity and as Jesus as a white man, and contrast to the caricature of the black person. They were all seen as lazy, as not working, but Jews were seen as benefiting from exploitation. And that, so again, similarities, but also significant differences. And black people, as this 1866 quote says, at the expense of white men. So you can see the exploitation versus the expense of white men. They were both seen and construed as carnal and sexually dangerous to women. In the case of Jews, to Christian women. In the case of black men, to white women. And you can see the ubiquitous really imagery of the lecherous Jew ogling these Christian white girls, women, and the lecherous black men. Again, very similar iconography looking in this. As we've seen in the iconography, both were visually represented as ugly. They were tropes of Jewish arrogance, insolence, the arrogant Jew and the uppity black person against a sort of very parallel yet slightly different. Different kinds of fears of power, fear of Jewish power, right? The anti-Semitic trope of Jewish power. And then here you have in the Reconstruction era, the fear of the Negro rule. And then in modern times, the fear of black power in similar ways. Both were construed as problem, or there was a question, the Jewish question in Europe and the Negro question in the United States. And it was posed by both anti-Semites and Jewish defenders, and on the other side by black intellectuals of trying to address the Negro problem, and also anti-Semites, right, in the same way. And then ultimately, both, as I've shown you in the quotes from the 19th and early and 18th century, both were refused to be accepted as equal citizens in different ways around different topics. So as I was sort of making these notes, and I was also teaching a class and preparing for a class on anti-Semitism and racism, which I caught up with my colleague in African American history, the quote and the essay by W.E.B. Du Bois, The Negro and the American and the Warsaw Ghetto, became really clear. For W.E.B. Du Bois, the American historian of black history and experience and the Reconstruction, when he visited Europe 3 times in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then after World War II, he says it was not much that he got a much clearer understanding of the Jewish problem in the world, as it was a more complete understanding of the Negro problem. For me, engaging with the literature on the black experience helped me get out of the rut of the frustrating history of anti-Semitism literature and begin to see my own material, which I have been teaching and writing about for many, many years, in a new light. And that essentially led to this deeper engagement with this book. So what's behind these striking parallels? We're talking about people whose historical experiences are so different. Jews were never enslaved and didn't suffer in similar atrocities as Black Americans. On the other hand, Jews, until really the 20th century, Jews were persecuted and were in positions of oppression. So why there are these similarities? What we understand from the study of racism is that it is about power. It's not about hatred. So much of the literature of anti-Semitism is centers about anti-Jewish hatred. But in Black history and the study of racism, the focus is on systems of power, systemic racism, we all have heard of it, law, structures. This is not something that is part of the conversation in the experience of a Jewish experience. And again, the question of power is really a tricky one because of the anti-Semitic trope of Jewish power. But in the text that I had known for many, many decades, I began to see the language of power and servitude rather than the language of hatred. And that would help me understand these striking parallels. So just quickly, in the earliest Christian texts, there's not yet the dynamic of power, but there's already a hierarchy of values attached to language and ideas that come to be associated with Jews and Judaism, and language and ideas that come to be associated with Christianity. And they're not value neutral. I highlighted for you in blue those related to Jews and Judaism, and the ones in gray related to Christianity and Christians, as they would be concerned. So law and faith. On the surface, could be value neutral, but for Paul, law has a negative, lower value. It's much more earthly, right? It represents the present Jerusalem, and in Paul's time, the present Jerusalem still had a temple standing with sacrifices. It created children for slavery, whereas Christianity and faith creates promise and leads to this sort of Jerusalem above, and she is free. He also talked about, Abraham's children, not all of them being true descendants, not the children of the flesh, who are the children of God, but the children of the promise. He sees Jews as being descendants according to flesh, and hence the carnality of Jews that goes back to this, whereas Christians are the children of the promise. So again, faith and that. And then he uses that faithful phrase from the book of Genesis, the elder shall serve the younger. And he uses it in the question of predestination, but it will really begin to mean something different when Christianity becomes a religion of the empire. So when the Christianity becomes the religion of empire, another Christian thinker, famous Augustine, returns to these contrast ideas that Paul outlined and talks about two covenants, the old and the new, one for the earthly city, that is Judaism, one for the heavenly city, Christianity. One symbolizes servitude, the other symbolizes freedom. One is shadows, the other one is light. And he explains that, quote, the elder shall serve the younger in different ways. Scarcely anyone among us has understood this phrase to mean anything else than the older people of the Jews should serve the younger people, the younger Christian people. What wouldn't be clearer than the reference that these two promises is one to the people of Israelites and to the whole world, the former according to flesh, the latter according to faith, right? And that later on gets translated into law. So it's not just in the ideas of theology, but it's in also law. So you have a prohibition against Jews owning slaves, not just Christian slaves, Christian slaves. Not Christians could own Christian slaves, but Jews could not own Christian slaves. And you can see, especially at the bottom one, the first quote still is sort of concerned with the spread of Judaism, but the second one begins to use the language of power. If one of the Jews shall buy and circumcise a Christian slave or of any other sect, he the slave shall be raised from the Jews' power and remain in liberty. Right? So there is a concern about the power that Jews might have over Christians. And other laws were issued against Jews, and specifically Jews. There's no other group, as far as I know, in Roman law that singles out a specific group. Jews are excluded from public office in 418. There is a prohibition to practice law and serve in state service. Why? Lest people of Christian law serve them, and lest their substitute, because of Jews' mastery, the venerable religion with a sect. Jews should not be appointed judges over Christian population, nor tax collectors, for thus Christians would be seen, God forbid, to be subjected to them. Now we begin to see a legal hierarchy that subjugates Jews to a lower position. Prohibition of intermarriage, prohibition of admitting Jews as witnesses against Christians, and it enters the legal framework of the Christian world. Here is Pope Gregory the Great reminding a Christian ruler that no Jew is permitted to hold a Christian slave in his power. Christian slaves to be found among them shall be given liberty. And it just begins to be repeated that Jews should not have authority over Christians, prohibiting Jews being in public office throughout Christian law. And by the 13th century, you get this sort of more fleshed out theological explanation of the law and the idea that Jews are consigned to perpetual servitude because they crucified Jesus, as this Pope says. And they shall not dare raise their neck bowed under the yoke of perpetual slavery. Again, lest the children of the free woman should be, and so on. So the language of that thing. And then at the bottom you can see that the Jews should recognize themselves as the slaves of those whom Christ's death set free, at the same time as it enslaved them. Henceforth, the perfidious Jews should not in any way dare grow insolent, right? So Jews were not enslaved, but the language of slavery was attached to them and embedded in law and social legal framework. And again, the language of perpetual servitude, this comes from a bull establishing the Roman ghetto in 1555. Again, they should not attempt exchanging their servitude they own to Christians for dominion over them, but they erupted in insolence. They lived like other Romans, they had nice houses, they had Christian servants, and so on and so forth. So the Pope reminded them that as long as they persist in their errors, they should recognize through experience that they have been made slaves while Christians have been made free through Jesus Christ, right? So we see it again and again, and lest you think it's just old stuff, medieval stuff. Here is a very similar language used in 1945 when after World War II ended and in Poland, and the Polish bishop tells Jews that you can help rebuild Poland. Why? But why do you engage in politics? Why are you trying to be in position of authority? Can you imagine what it looks like when a priest comes into the ministry and a Jewish woman is sitting there, God knows from where, and treats our clergy with superiority and insolence, right? He may not be thinking Paul or Augustine. He may not be reflecting on Innocent III or Paul IV, but that legal language and theological language of Jewish servitude created habits of thinking about Jews as inferior and that discomfort of their position of power. And that's also translated in the visual language. We see in the year 70, after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, the Romans issued a coin, Judea Capta. Judea has been captured, and Judea is represented as this sort of crying woman dominated by the Roman soldier. We've seen this in the dominating Christian queen, ecclesia and synagoga, and this imagery is ubiquitous with ecclesia as this Christianity as this dominant queen here, and frequently coupled with that humiliated synagoga. And there is also an idea of Ecclesia Imperatrix, the Empress Church, and you can see that imagery ubiquitous. By the early modern period, the moment of colonization, the idea, the figure of Ecclesia, of Christianity, changes into Europa. She is still a Christian queen. You can see the crown, and she's holding the globe with the cross, but she's no longer dominating the synagogue and Judaism and Jews. She's now dominating the other continents. And they are all looking down in that reminiscent pose of synagogue. And that again becomes a ubiquitous iconography of representing Europa as this European white Christian queen against these other continents. By the height of the slave trade, Africa becomes racialized as black. Before that, she is more associated with North Africa. And we see it in law. And again, I talk more about it. And you can see that there is both race, no Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, although Christians, and religion, or Jews, Moors, and Mahometans, that is Muslims, and other infidels, so purchase any Christian servant nor any other except of their own complexion. But if any Negro, mulatto, Indian, Jew, Moor, Mahometan, and so on, should notwithstanding purchase a Christian white servant, the said servant shall become free. That's the law we saw against Jews in the Roman Empire. It's now applied here, but in the both racial and political hierarchy. So we can see the sort of white Christian supremacy of putting people who are not white Christians in a different legal level. So liberty or freedom, libertas, is represented, again, in that iconography we've seen earlier, as a white woman. And in America, after the United States becomes an independent state, America changes race too. So we begin to see Colombia or libertas as the white woman. Before that, you see America as the sort of savage woman, and then Colombia is again in that reminiscent pose of the ecclesia. I'm now going to slowly wrap up. So just to return to in the Enlightenment, we see also invention of race in the case of black people to justify the slavery. But also Jews become racialized through religion. They are seen placed in the Middle East because of Judaism emerging from that region. And they focus on the practices of ancient Israelites and are essentially showing Jews as these sort of backward primitive people in this way. And they are de-Europeanized, those who are in Europe, Orientalized. Here they are compared to the East Indians, for instance. And by the time we get to those quotes and the debates over citizenship, those ideas of social hierarchy really clash with the modern ideas of equality, and the question becomes whether Jews become to the new we. And as we've seen, the answer was no, and I'm going to skip that. I just want to see that once equality comes in, once Jews receive citizenship, they are racialized as a Semitic race with its homeland in Palestine, and their equality is seen as alien domination. Right? So the idea that the equality becomes a domination. And the problem is that Jews are elected as officials because they now can be elected and are made legislators and judges against the sort of centuries of the law that we've seen this. And a reminder that Jews, again, are they demand parity, but they are, after all, a minority, and they should not be given parity. So therefore, they are excluded from that equality, and that equality is seen as unearned, usurped position of power, right? And we see it today in the sort of habits of thinking, as Jews have too much, they don't deserve to be in positions where they believe, and in terms of the Black people, we see it in a different version in this. They're not deserving because they are inferior back because those notions of blackness and inferiority that came in from the enslavement. I'll skip this. Just sort of to summarize that the domination over Jews comes from an idea and then turns into law, and that reinforces the social hierarchy. In case of anti-Black racism, the enslavement and the power comes first, then the idea of race and racism emerges, and that hierarchy, and then that leads to the white, I argue, Christian supremacy. And final thought on what this has done for me in the approaches to the study of racism and anti-Semitism. This is strange. Anti-Semitism studies perpetrators, anti-Semitic literature and imagery exposing anti-Semitic ideas, focuses on emotion. What is missing is the Jewish experience. In the study of racism, we have a focus on the victims of racism and the impact of racism on these victims. There's a reluctance to publish racist images and language. The focus is on policies and what they do, and it's understood as a legacy of slavery. So, thank you.
Thank you, Magda, for that
comprehensive summary. I want to begin with a big question, and we'll get to some of the distinctions that you have talked about, and a little bit more about anti-Black racism. But the first question is, what is it about Christianity that requires that foil? Classically played by the Jew, as the classic other in Christian society, and as you've now excavated, the Black person. What is it about Christianity? I mean, you're in about as good a position as anyone I know to answer that question.
So it's interesting when I sometimes with students do like a little word cloud association. What comes to mind when you think about Christianity? They obviously put Jesus, but there's love, there is charity, there is faith. These are the associations. Nobody puts question of power. When I do Judaism, they put law, community, all kinds of things like that. Not faith, not love, not charity, nothing of that sort. And it becomes very clear that these students, before they've read anything, they kind of absorb these values that I told you about, right? And in the sort of popular culture in this way. So I think what is interesting is that we think about Christianity in those terms of faith, and we don't. The aspect of Christianity as power is often missing. And what it is in terms of Christianity, I don't know whether it's in terms of Christianity, but it evolves from Christianity, right? Christianity becomes the dominant religion of the empire, and if Christianity had remained that little sect within Judaism, ancient Judaism in Judea, it may not have survived the destruction of the temple and what happened afterwards. But we may be talking about Christians or Jews in the same way as we talk about Samaritans, and my students don't know who Samaritans are. But the problem is that Christianity, as it spread, took its own sort of insecurity and its own kind of problem with Jews and the need to distinguish and prove that they hold the truth and Jews are wrong, and universalized it. So even when you didn't have Jews in places, you had ideas about Jews and how they are wrong and how they are killers of Christ and how they are all these things. And Christianity is the one who's holding the truth. So that led to that thing. And because they are in a monotheistic religion, so some argue not, but monotheistic religion, believing in the truth, they legislated that kind of truth.
Right. So we have, an obvious example to compare to, a comparator, which is Islam, right? A monotheistic tradition.
Yeah.
And it seems to me what you're arguing is the intensity of the familial relationship between Judaism and Christianity is a driver, whether one adopts the parent-child familiar analogy or metaphor, or the sibling analogy, metaphor. That intensity produced the insecurity that made the demand for domination.
Right.
And of course, supersession. So
right,
evident.
Exactly, because the relationship is not just my students are like, why couldn't they just accept them and just like, okay, we believe in Jesus and you guys don't. But that insecurity leads to that kind of suppression and supersession. But the other thing I think is important is Jews matter to Christians far more than Christians to Jews. There's no writing about Christians and Judaism and ancient Judaism until centuries later, when Christianity becomes an issue. Mm-hmm. There's writing about Jews from the first decades, right? So Jews play a bigger role in Christian imagination and identity. And I also want to address the idea of Islam.
I just want to say, what the literary critic Harold Bloom would say, the anxiety of influence.
The anxiety of influence, right. About Islam, you're right, but at the same time, Islam, the legal framework of Islam that Islam creates for the dhimmi, for the non-Muslims, is modeled exactly on the Roman law concerning Jews, right? So there is the legacy, the Christian legacy in Islam as well, even though that theological relationship is less stark in its conception of what
the familiar relationship is less
Right.
intense. It's
Yeah.
a familiar relationship, but distant cousins rather than siblings.
right.
So can you help us understand what makes for that transition from supersession to supremacy?
Yeah, law. So
Law.
I use law. I use the word supremacy not in the kind of loose term when we hear now about some, skinheads saying, oh, white supremacists in that way, but in a much more technical way of holding power and authority. And that moves from the realm of theology to the realm of power. In affecting the legal status of Jews, where they are no longer Roman citizens entitled to the same rights and privileges of other Roman citizens, but there are no specific laws that are prohibiting Jews from certain, as what I showed you. Mm-hmm. And again, what is striking is these are exactly the areas where we see then in anti-black racism, anti-miscegenation laws against black people being witnesses to against white people and things like that. So it creates a kind of a model for superiority.
So the real chiddush, the real innovation in this book is not to tell the story of Christian anti-Judaism, because that story has been told amply by you, by others, mm-hmm. Including in particularly David Nierenberg. Mm-hmm. But it is to focus on, to discover, to excavate the place of anti-black racism in Christianity. I'm just, when do you understand race to become an operative category mm-hmm. in European culture and society?
So I think I would rephrase it that it's a connection, creating connection between the two, mm-hmm. because I think American scholars of anti-black racism have certainly praised Christianity in it, and there's a lot of work on Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism in America. But what I am doing is I'm connecting the story. I'm saying that this is not just an American story of racism and race here, but that story and those patterns of thinking developed first earlier in antiquity and in centuries earlier in relation to Jews. And they help create that kind of model for Christians and European Christians, because Christianity, although it becomes global, with the rise of Islam, it kind of is mostly North African and European phenomenon, with obviously Christians existing in the Middle East and also in parts of East Africa, but it really is where Christianity develops most fully. So that creates that sense of first theological superiority that develops against Jews, then European superiority with the expansion. And what I see it in terms of is the moment of European expansion. And Iberia is really the key place for many reasons. Iberia also develops this idea of purity of blood that are not just aristocratic purity of blood, but also against Jews and against non-Christians, after Jews convert and expelled, and then the language that is used for to Jews about perpetual servitude is then used against the non-Europeans and as a need. So that becomes the kind
Iberia plays an important part in your story.
Part in that transition from the supersessionist Christian supremacy about Jews to the racialized Christian dominance that we see then being enacted in the colonies.
So maybe tell us how that works. So as we know, as we learned in our seminars at Columbia University in 1449 in Toledo, a purity of blood statute is introduced, directed against those who are called new Christians, Jews who converted.
Yes.
Which was a distinction that pretty much didn't exist before, because if you converted, the church said you were to be accepted as a full Christian. Now there's this new standard, this racial standard, that locals in Toledo are introducing to set up barriers to this new class of former Jews who are going to gain entry to office, political office, and high commerce. That model becomes the basis of, as you understand it, of a new racialism that is imported into Christianity.
Right.
Yes?
Yes. Although there is still the religious aspect that remains in that, right? Because it's not necessarily only about race, but it's about that sort of genealogy of heresy in the Iberian case. But it helps create those frameworks, and also that existing framework of Jewish inferiority, the perpetual servitude that helps the non-Christians be subsumed under that inferiority. And even when they convert, they are not fully, purely as European Christians. And the Catholics actually accepted conversions from all groups, but they created that hierarchy in different ways. Protestants did not allow for conversions of people of color and enslaved Africans, because of that liberty sets you free. If you become a Christian, you become free. And they didn't want that kind of to become an excuse. So it functions slightly differently in Protestant and in Catholic colonies. But really that switch to that racialized Christianity is in the early modern period with the European expansion and European colonialism into the New World.
Okay, so then we make our way to the Age of Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Emancipation, as you showed us, and as you talk about it at length. And here, our expectation is, well, all of these restrictions are going to be released. The price to pay is you have to discard your kind of particularist language and mode of dress and way of acting differently. And in exchange for that, the social contract says you'll be granted admission as a full equal citizen. That's not exactly what happened. Our teacher's teacher wrote a very famous essay called Ghetto and Emancipation, in which he argued that the status of Jews in the Middle Ages was actually pretty good in the confines of the ghetto, and in fact the confines of the ghetto allowed for a very substantial amount of communal identity to be preserved. Whereas in the modern period, counterintuitively, the Age of Emancipation and Enlightenment, not only was the Jew stripped away of that thick form of communal identity, but new forms of discrimination emerged. Right. And in fact, Enlightenment wasn't as bright and shiny as. So how do these two figures of the Christian imaginary fare in the Age of Enlightenment and Emancipation?
So certainly, I mean, we all understand Enlightenment as Enlightenment has given us a lot, right? Has given us ideas of equality, rights. Liberal democracy gradually developed out of those enlightened ideas, but it also bequeathed to us ideas of race and racial hierarchy. So Enlightenment comes at the time at the height of slave trade, and you have these philosophers, some of whom in fact engage in slave trade or invest in slave trade, who are struggling with the fact that they hope for this equality or claim that everyone is equal, everybody is born equal, and yet there is all this slave trade going on. So they needed to justify that, and they developed this idea that black people are certainly naturally inferior and therefore they can be enslaved. That's the way they were created. And they are absolutely obsessed with blackness. There's a wonderful book by Andrew Curran, Anatomy of Blackness. Voltaire, for instance, was a polygenist. He could not accept that black people came from the same kind of stock as he and his peers, white Europeans. So they were struggling with making sense of that horror in light of their ideas of equality and natural rights.
So it's this fascinating
so
clash.
There's this clash. So they create this whole concept of blackness. For Jews, they, as I say, orientalized Jews. They, through religion, through the study of religion, they put Jews outside of Europe, European Jews outside of Europe. They make them Orientals, and therefore inferior to the Europeans. And when it comes to the idea of equal rights, then you have those debates that were going on, whether all these people deserve to be equally treated, and they cannot conceive of the fact that they would have to share that, right? Because when you have centuries of someone inferior, and then that person comes to the equality, it feels that they don't deserve to be there. So once Jews actually get citizenship rights, there's an immediate backlash, which we know by the end of the 19th century as political antisemitism. In America, when black Americans get equal rights after the Civil War, there is the immediate backlash through Jim Crow laws and other ways of things. And they happen at the same time, right? The failure or the end of Reconstruction is in the 1870s. The manifestation of political anti-Semitism in Europe is 1870s. It happens exactly at the same time. They don't necessarily talk to each other, but there are these parallel political developments, but targeting different groups. And the interesting thing is that the responses are also similar. On both sides, Jews are producing all this literature about Jewish contributions to civilization, trying to prove how they can be respected and black Americans also have all these books about from slavery to respectable citizenship and all these, similar ways of things. So that's what.
Right. Yeah, though in terms of the connection between here and there, the legal historian, as you know, James Whitman, has written quite persuasively about a very counterintuitive notion that, in fact, the United States exports to Germany racial ideas that become part and parcel of Nazi ideology, which then echo back. But so you have the simultaneity, or maybe the sequential sequencing of this new ethos and philosophy of equality. Right? Everyone is possessed of the capacity for human reason and thus a potential equal citizen, followed by the emergence, and you can see how it's very much an Enlightenment project, of new scientific ideas that classify human beings differentially. Right? That's kind of the foremost attestation to the social construction of science. Right? You have to figure out what's going to be an idiom that can serve to exclude after we've made this gambit to say everything's open. As I always imagine it, there's a new edifice. It's the edifice of European Enlightenment. The Jew is invited in, and as the Jew crosses the threshold, the door begins to close, reflecting that incredible ambivalence on the part of European society. But what is really important to note is that scientific scheme of classification.
And the idea of national ethnicity, right? And you can see it already at the end of the 18th century. And Moses Mendelssohn, the famous Jewish philosopher, captured it. It's like, why are you suddenly talking not about Jews and Christians, but about Jews and Germans? Because when you talk about religion, that the boundaries might be permeable, right? Religion, you can switch religions, you can talk about religion. But once you start talking along the lines of ethnicity, you can't suddenly become one, right? So in Europe, it develops along those sort of, again, ethnic and then racial lines as well.
Yeah. Okay, I have a few more questions, and then I'd like to open up, and we'll wrap up by 5:30. I want to ask you about a figure who is important in your book, quite central, and I think who must have emerged out of that process of new education as you became familiar with the literature on anti-Black racism, and that's James Baldwin. Can you tell us why Baldwin was significant in your book?
Baldwin is, he's a very, it's important because my aha moment came out of that, watching the film, right? But he also is an important thinker about race in 20th century America, and he, many people call him a prophet. I say in the book that he's not a prophet, it's just that we haven't changed much in the way, so his words still resonate with us. But he really had a very, he in terms of his relations with Jews, there are a lot of some problematic writings, which I would argue against some of his notions of Jewish whiteness and things like that. But he had a very powerful ways of thinking about history, and about thinking, he talks about history being, we live history, it's embodied in us, right? So this sort of thinking about habits of thought, that we are created, we're part of that history. I think that's for me very, very important. That helps understand that as my students may not have read all those things, but they understand Judaism is about law and about this, and Christianity is about that, right? We are sort of created through this history.
Yeah, he has about as strong and, I think, well-crafted a sense of the triangulated relationship amongst Jews, Christians, and blacks. Mm-hmm. Like his understanding of where Jewish anti-blackness comes from takes him back to, in that one essay, Rome. And
right,
Christian Rome.
Yeah.
Christianity emerging out of Rome.
Yeah.
So he seems extremely valuable in that regard.
Exactly.
As sort of
he connects that Christian domination in his both Christian racism, but also in the exclusion.
Around the time that he was thinking of the relationship amongst Jews, Christians, and blacks, and trying to understand anti-Semitism and Jewish anti-black racism, and certainly sort of the underpinnings of Christian anti-black racism and anti-Semitism. Around that same time, the Vatican is beginning a process of confronting its past, and produces a process and a document, ultimately, called Nostra Aetate, often referred to as Vatican II, which many people read as a transformation of the Christian church, sort of throwing off of the yoke of its erstwhile anti-Judaism. You seem not to have such a generous view of Vatican II.
Yeah, I have 2 chapters. The book ends with 2 chapters on reckoning, and I call one a stunted reckoning after World War II, the atrocities of the Shoah, that there was a moment that could have served the reckoning with Christian anti-Semitism, but also with anti-black racism, and that doesn't happen and takes decades. The Nostra Aetate is an interesting document, emerged from that need to 2 decades later, and after a lot of work by intellectuals behind the scenes, and yet when you read it, it doesn't really.
It doesn't deliver, you say, what we think
it doesn't deliver. It still casts Jews in that sort of ancient world as the roots of Christianity, and only for that reason. It doesn't acknowledge the living Judaism. It doesn't say anything positive about Judaism that it can offer, but the previous paragraphs about other religions, including Islam and Buddhism, actually say that we can learn something from that. So,
as opposed to, as you say, we took something from ancient Judaism.
That's right.
And we took the mantle of the spiritual, the desiccated spiritual Israel.
And this year is the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, 2025.
Do you know that?
And it's interesting because it's not a perfect document, but I think at this time it can offer us a lesson that we should not be upset when something is not perfect. It was not a perfect document, but it opened up decades of dialogue and conversation. And
In the spirit of let not the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That's exactly right. It did turn back against the trope of Jews being accused of killing Jesus, right? The day side thing. It did condemn anti-Semitism as being not Christian, but of course that's a problematic way of thinking about it. It opened up a path that allowed for reconciliation. Where are we now? That's a question, whether we're reverting to a different moment 60 years later, but we can have a conversation about it.
Okay, on that theme, I want to ask my final question, which is, in thinking of the Jew as a kind of figural representation in Christianity, much more than a real physical being, the sort of a figure in the Christian imaginary. I'm wondering if you think that the creation of the State of Israel concretizes the Jew in a way that alters the equation. I mean, here I'm thinking of the well-known distinction made by the Berkeley historian Yuri Slezkin in his book, The Jewish Century, between Mercurian Jews, sort of the fleet, boundary-crossing, polyglot exemplars of modernity, and Apollonians, who are landed and rooted and local. Has that rootedness rendered the Jew more concrete, more real in ways that have altered the equation?
Well, I think the State of Israel has amplified the notion of sort of Jewish power. And I think some of the opposition to the existence of the State of Israel is an opposition to that real manifestation of Jewish power. I don't talk about it in the book because Israel is not really there. This is but I also think that it essentially contradicts that notion, the centuries-old notion of Jewish exile and punishment for Jews' sins, and is sort of thinking about those habits of thinking. It clashes with those centuries of thinking. So
right,
I think
that seems to be reflected in the Vatican's troubled relations with the State of Israel for precisely those reasons, as distinct from the long current into the 19th century of Christian Zionism, very much associated with Protestantism, and now very centrally in evangelical Protestantism, which has a different understanding of the relationship, to be sure.
And the land.
And the land, for its own reasons, which are not entirely philo-Semitic, we might say.
They're not.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to open up to questions.
I'll let you.
The woman in the back, and we'll just move forward. You, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Libby Clay. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, considering the whole subject of domination and interruption of ideas, if you put aside the Jewish part and the black part for a moment, and you think of right now the use of the president on the gay people directed ammunition toward something the matter with them, and so I ask you, isn't this kind of behavior that came before the Jewish and black question, that there was a need for some leaders to manipulate their population by directing them some way, diverting them from real problems, and just like what's happening right now, isn't that the type of thing that really this is basically?
Okay.
So I think if I understand the question, Jews have always been instrumentalized for political struggles and political gains, and anti-Jewish sentiments or anti-black sentiments, for that matter, were also understood to be so powerful because of those sort of centuries of thinking about Jews, that they became very useful for all kinds of political things. But you're right, it's usually to conceal certain other problems or to use them for political gain. whether it is from, and this is what I wrote discuss in my book, Blood Libel, whether it is using these episodes for political manifestations of political power, or other deaths of children being used for political gain, or war in the Middle East being used for political gain, or it's not a new thing. But you're right, it essentially distracts from a real problem, which means that the real problem is never addressed, and you can always continue blaming whoever you want to blame, whether it is Jews or whether it is immigrants or whether it's other kinds of groups that might be seen as deflecting the problem. But yes, it's a pattern that you can see through history, but what you have to see, and what it allows us to see is what are the impeti that lead to this kind of focus, right, on a specific group or on Jews in this way, rather than I would hate us to think, well, it's always been like that, right? But these are very concrete political reasons why this is happening in the way it is happening.
I will make our way forward. Chaim.
A point and then a question. To what extent, actually this was a question, to what extent did the Hamitic hypothesis have anything to do with the emergence of the second class notion of blackness? What role did that play? That's number one. And number two, you focus on law as the tool, but the reality is that the tool could only be wielded once Christianity assumed power. So it was the association with the Roman Empire that really made that work. So communities of power can use their power to exclude. And it seems to me that even though you write about Christianity, that was also a Jewish experience with Islam. The whole Dimitude is an expression of that.
Yeah.
And I see, actually, I know not whether I'm saying anything that's right. Maybe that's what unites both the right and the left in their anti-Semitism, because the symbol of Israel as power is actually resented both from the right and from the left. And there's a commonality. And even though there's a different way of manifesting itself, but the idea that underlies both forms of discrimination is definitely the same notion, and has to do with the maintenance. There's something about the seduction of power that actually overwhelms the religious and corrupts the religious tradition itself.
Yes. So the idea of Ham, and that's the curse, right? That's going back to the curse that helps sort of frame the curse by God. Both are cursed by God, so that definitely plays a role. There's even a kind of Jews are cursed by God, the black people are cursed by God. There are different sort of reasons why they are, but the curse is there, right? So they're cursed people.
So it's determined. It means
yes, it's determined, right? So once you're cursed, you are on the outside. You are something to be despised. So definitely that plays a role. In terms of in the earlier our discussion, I mentioned we talked about Islam. Absolutely, the idea of the dhimmi and this structure. I mean, it draws from Roman law, and it creates the legal structures of Jewish and Christian inferiority, which plays itself out in very interesting ways in the colonial era, because you have the inferior Christians from the Muslim perspective trying to dominate areas that were under Islamic rule. So you have inferior groups dominating that. And then in terms of Zionism, it's of course another kind of dhimmi inferior group making political claims, right? I mean, even when you look at the PLO documents or even Hamas documents, but even earlier before that, they all claim, well, we don't mind anything, we don't mind Jews, we're not against Jews, they can live in our entity, we just don't want them to be ruling over us, right? It's about political power. So it definitely goes against, again, those centuries of legal structures. That's why I think, yes, communally, I may not, want to socialize with this person or that person, or I don't like people who go to that church or that synagogue or whatever else. I may not eat in their homes or this and that. You can have forms of exclusion, of social exclusion. But when you have law behind, it adds mechanism of enforcement. And that kind of the legal scholar Ian Hani Lopez says it reifies the ideas, right? So once you have the idea that Jews are inferior, well, fine, you might think about us Jews being theologically inferior, whatever, I am whatever you were thinking. But once you have it that you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you cannot do that, suddenly, oh, you shouldn't have a Christian servant. Why are you hiring someone? Right? You have a different legal structure. You should not have power over me and things like that. And in Islam, the same thing, right? So these power structures create also certain social hierarchies and certain cultural hierarchies and expectations. So there's a sort of mutual reinforcement that law both reflects but also creates and reinforces social dynamics.
Yes, and then you'll be last. Yep.
I'm not sure how to frame this. I mean, the whole thesis of obviously this lecture is about the roots of anti-Semitism and racism. And anti-Semitism, Christian variety, is basically centuries old. And all the Jews who were there at the time were white. And so it was basically a very, very directed, anti-Semitic, but towards a white group. Now you have the state of Israel, where 60% of the population is not necessarily white. It's a variety of people. Some of them are actually African, and they come from other places. So do these two thoughts now, and just occur to me that are they kind of consolidating, that now you've got the racism that was basically aimed at blacks, or Africans, or others, and the anti-Semitism that was aimed at Jews, and now you have them both in the same place. And how does that now change the whole discourse? I mean, you can hear it politically about, these days, right? Israel is an apartheid state. Israel basically is a racist country, and so forth and so on. So it seems like these two thoughts, these two streams, now suddenly are colliding or merging, and I don't know where that's going to take us. I don't know what thoughts you have about that.
Okay, so white, it depends. So I assume we're talking about modern 19th century anti-Semitism, right? Okay, but the structures come in earlier, right? They emerge in the Roman Empire. There's no concept of whiteness or blackness or anything. I mean, there are people notice different color skins, but there's no sort of racial concept as we are. But by the 19th century, Jews in Europe, who may have been different before that, in the pre-modern period on a religion, maybe not have been liked, may have been inferior legally, but kind of were taken for granted as part of the European states and cities and towns and things like that. After the Enlightenment and that sort of orientalization of Jews, and by placing Judaism in what Europeans called Palestine, they removed Jews from, I call it in the book, de-Europeanized European Jews. That's why they're beginning to see them as foreigners, as alien in that way. So they are actually racialized as not white in Europe by European anti-Semites who apply the racial categories and so the paradox of now is that on the left and people in the region, they see Jews as white, and also in America in this way, but they were not seen at the time as Europeans, right? Even though they may have been there for thousands of years, right? We have records of Jews living in Cologne from 4th century CE, but that didn't matter. They were not European. They were Orientals. They belonged to Palestine, right? That was the European thing. The current moment of attaching whiteness is really a product of a very short, recent decades, really a post-war period, where you have the power of Israel, right, as a state, so the Jews in power, the manifestation of Jews in power, and also the social rise of American Jews in public life and public sphere. But no one would talk about Jews in those categories earlier. Jews were, I call them in book, white by law, because they were allowed to immigrate in the United States, and you could only immigrate and be naturalized in the United States if you're right since 1790, the Naturalization Act. So they were kind of white by law. They were able to immigrate. But later on, of course, that didn't mean total inclusion. There were ways of social and legal exclusion as well, covenants, prohibition of elections, being officials, and things like that. So that kind of categorization that we're hearing about Jews as white is really a more recent product. And going back to Baldwin, I think Baldwin kind of associates the Jewish social climate and becoming American citizen, as becoming white. And
Christian.
Right, and Christian because and again, the American legal system was organized around that. So if you become to be integrated, that becomes.
Okay, our final question.
So how open is history of acknowledging the fact that we are talking about all this racism, but east of the Levant is the actual, what I would say, the origin of equality? Does history acknowledge that, in the sense that we have equality that was originating in Babylon, very specifically, then it came to Israel, across the Atlantic, served as a manual of leadership to the founding fathers and the founding of America on the basis of that exemplary ruler. And then you have the Magna Carta. Then it stays dormant for about 1700 years. Then you have the Magna Carta, and there is no mention of how the Magna Carta impacted as far as Jewishness is concerned. Then you have the French independence, you have the American independence, and that is how history progresses. You just wanted your opinion on that.
I'm not sure, but I'll just say that Magna Carta is actually interesting because there are two clauses concerning Jews, and I always use Magna Carta. Nobody knows about it, but how many of you knew that Magna Carta has 2 paragraphs concerning Jews?
What are they?
So they deal with the question of banking and loan and debts, and because it's a political document that is around that is negotiating the power relation between the barons and the king, and Jews are part of that sort of power structure. I always use it to show students how integrated Jews were in the sort of workings of states and politics before the modern era. But we, of course, understand Magna Carta as only for the habeas corpus thing. So your question is so broad that I don't even sort of know how to address it. So I think it will take.
I can be specific, but I'll talk to you after the.
Sure,
Great.
that sounds great. That
Great.
sounds great.
Before we wrap up, I would like to extend our thanks and appreciation to the staff of the Levy Center for all the hard work it does. So thank you to the staff.
Thank you.
And, of course, to our most stimulating speaker this afternoon, Professor Magda Teter. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here.
And please, I encourage you to buy this book, Christian Supremacy, which is so rich and thought-provoking and can be purchased, as it turns out, can be purchased right here in this room. So please, after saying a word to Magda, make your way
Yes.
to the gentleman
And
in the
there's
back.
also an audiobook.
Oh.
I don't read it, so you don't have to deal with me, but there's another person who reads it. Thank you.
Great.